My name is Diane Kessler. I'm 44 years old, and I was standing in my own kitchen in a navy blue dress I bought specifically for that night, holding a tray of seared scallops I plated myself, when my husband put his hand on my lower back, not affectionately, but the way you'd steer a caterer toward the service entrance, and said, low enough that only I could hear it over the string quartet, "Go check on the kitchen, honey. Servants don't sit with us. I want you to picture the room. White orchids on every table, because I'd order them myself. 102 guests, most of them his partners and clients from the firm, in a rented white blazer that cost more than my first car payment. Candlelight catching the rim of a wine glass someone had left on the piano. And me, in the dress, holding a tray, being told by the man I had funded, fed, and forgiven for 11 years that I did not belong at my own table. He didn't know yet that I'd already met with a lawyer 3 weeks earlier. He didn't know that the business account he thought only he could access had a second signatory clause he'd forgotten I still held. He smiled at his guests as he walked away from me, certain that this was just another Tuesday in a marriage he assumed was permanent. It wasn't. But to understand how I ended up in that kitchen, in that dress, holding that tray, you have to go back 11 years, to a much smaller kitchen, and a much smaller version of the man I married. Part 1. I met Gregory Pruitt when I was 33, at a fundraising dinner for a housing nonprofit I did pro bono structural consulting for. I owned, at the time, a small structural engineering firm, 6 employees, a decade of work behind me building it from a card table in my apartment into an actual firm with an actual office and actual payroll. I am good at my job. I say that plainly, not out of vanity, but because it matters to the story. I have never in my adult life been unable to support myself. Gregory was at that point a management consultant between contracts, funny in the self-deprecating way that men are funny right before you find out the self-deprecation was a strategy. He made me laugh at that dinner, and he asked good questions about beam loads, which almost nobody at a fundraising dinner ever does. I liked him. I liked, more specifically, the version of him that existed in those early years, attentive, a little in awe of what I'd built, always saying things like, "I don't know how you do it all." We married 2 years later, in a courthouse, because neither of us wanted a production. I remember thinking, standing in that hallway with the marble floor and the fluorescent lights, that I had found someone who saw me clearly. I believed that for a long time. Here is the daily ritual I need you to remember, because it comes back later. Every morning, no matter what, I woke at 5:15 before Gregory, before the sun most months, and I ground coffee beans by hand in a small cast-iron grinder that had belonged to my grandmother. Not because I needed the coffee to be good, though it was, but because those 15 minutes of grinding, slow and rhythmic, were the only part of my day that belonged entirely to me. I did it in silence. I did it before I checked my phone, before I opened my email, before I became anyone's wife or anyone's boss. Just my hands, the beans, the smell rising up before the world asked anything of me. When Gregory's consulting work dried up in our 3rd year of marriage, a merger that ate his firm, a non-compete that boxed him out of his industry for 18 months, I didn't hesitate. I moved $40,000 from my business's reserve account into a personal transfer to help him start his own consultancy. I told myself it was an investment in us. I co-signed the lease on his first office space. I worked Saturdays for 2 years so that my firm's growth could absorb the slack while his got off the ground. I did the books for his company for free for the first 18 months because he couldn't afford a bookkeeper yet and didn't want to hire cheap. I am not telling you this to sound like a martyr. I'm telling you because it's a fact pattern, and fact patterns matter later. I gave. He took. For a long time, I told myself,
My sister's name is Renata. She's 2 years older than me, a family law paralegal by profession, which turned out to matter enormously, and she has never in her life let me talk myself out of something I already knew was true. Show me everything, she said, the first time we sat down at her kitchen table with my laptop between us. Not what you think it means. Just show me what you actually have. What I actually had, at first, was almost nothing: a receipt, a feeling, 11 years of history telling me I was imagining things. Renata didn't let me stop there. Over the next 5 weeks, quietly, carefully, we built a file. Renata taught me how to pull our joint credit card statements going back 18 months, and there they were. Recurring charges to a hotel called the Larkspur Inn, always on Tuesdays, always between $100 and $200, 14 times in 18 months. A florist charge for $310 that I had never received flowers for. A charge from a jewelry store in April, $640, for a cleaning and repair on a piece I'd never taken in, because I checked, because Renata told me to call and ask. Then came the business records, which is where it stopped being about an affair and became something else entirely. I still had read access to Pruitt and Associates' operating account from the early years, when I'd done his books, access he'd apparently forgotten to revoke. Over 3 nights, after Gregory was asleep, I went through 18 months of transfers. There was a line item, recurring monthly $4,200, going out to an LLC called Larkspur Creative Consulting. Same name as the hotel. I looked up the LLC's registration. It had been filed 14 months earlier by a woman named Vanessa Okafor, who I recognized, once I looked her up, as Gregory's newest business development hire, the one he'd introduced to me at a firm holiday party as sharp, really sharp, going to be great for us. $4,200 a month for 14 months to a consulting LLC with 1 employee and no visible clients that shared a name with the hotel he was visiting on Tuesdays. $58,000 of what I now understood to be marital business income, funneled quietly into what I can only describe as a second life. I didn't cry when Renata laid it out on her kitchen table, the printouts organized by date in a manila folder, her handwriting in the margins. I remember setting my coffee cup down very carefully on the coaster, the way you set something down when you don't trust your own hands. I remember Renata reaching over and putting her palm flat on the folder, like she was keeping it from blowing away, and saying, "You don't have to decide anything tonight. But you need a lawyer who isn't me, because I'm too close to this to be objective, and you need one now." I found Patricia Alvarez through a colleague at my firm, a family law attorney with a reputation for being quiet, thorough, and utterly unbothered by drama. I sat in her office on a Thursday afternoon, the manila folder on my lap, and I told her everything. She read through it without changing her expression once, which I appreciated more than I can say. "Here's what I want you to understand," Patricia said, closing the folder. "You have 3 things working in your favor. You have documentation of marital funds diverted to what looks like an affair-adjacent LLC, which matters enormously in equitable distribution. You have a business, your business, that predates the marriage and, from what you're telling me, was never commingled with his. And you have time, because he doesn't know you know anything. Do not let anyone rush you into telling him before the structure is in place. The moment he knows, he'll start protecting assets, and everything gets harder. Before I tell you what happened next, comment below and let me know which city or which country you're watching this from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is even harder to sit through than this one. So I did the quiet, unglamorous work. I opened a new personal checking account at a bank Gregory had never used, in my name only, and over 6 weeks I moved my portion of our joint savings into it in increments small enough not to trigger alerts on either of our phones. I contacted the mortgage lender, alone, on my lunch break, and confirmed that the house, which we owned jointly, but which I had put the larger down payment on from my own premarital savings, had a paper trail Patricia said would matter. I quietly began the process of separating my firm's accounts from anything that touched our joint finances, closing a line of credit I'd once co-signed for Gregory's company before he could draw against it further. Patricia filed the initial paperwork 9 days before the anniversary party. 9 days before he stood in front of 100 guests and asked me to check on the kitchen because servants don't sit with the family. I need to tell you about the setback because it almost cost me everything I'd built. For days before the party, Renata called me in a panic. She'd been keeping a mirrored copy of our evidence folder on her laptop, just in case, and her laptop had been stolen out of her car outside a grocery store. Nothing else taken, just the laptop out of a bag that also had her wallet sitting right on top of it. We didn't know in that moment if it was a random theft or something else. Gregory had been strange for the past week, short with me over small things, distracted in a way that felt less like guilt and more like fear. I remember standing in my own kitchen with the phone against my ear, Renata's voice tight and fast, and thinking, he knows. He knows, and he's coming for the evidence before I can use it. I called Patricia that same night. She was calm in the specific way that made me calm. First, she said, everything that matters is already filed with the court or backed up on secure servers on my end, not just on a personal laptop. Second, even if he suspects something, suspecting is not the same as knowing, and confronting his own wife 4 days before a 100-person anniversary party he's spent months planning is a very different kind of risk for him than it is for you. He has more to lose right now by blowing this up than you do. She was right, though I didn't fully believe her until the party itself, when I watched him greet his business partners with that easy, practiced warmth, completely unaware that anything in his life was about to change. Whatever had made him short with me that week, it wasn't this. It was something else, something smaller, pressure at work, maybe, or the ordinary strain of managing 2 lives. He truly did not know. I want to be honest. For about 36 hours after that phone call, I considered stopping. Not because I doubted the evidence, but because I was tired and scared, and some old, small part of me wondered if it was easier to just let the marriage keep running on its momentum, the way you let a car coast downhill even after you've taken your foot off the gas. I sat with that feeling for a night. And then I thought about the $40,000 I'd moved into his first office space. I thought about the Saturdays. I thought about the $58,000 going quietly to Larkspur Creative Consulting while I stayed home doing his books for free. And the tiredness turned into something more useful. The party itself went almost exactly as planned, his plan, that is. I had spent 4 full days cooking, because I'd insisted on it, over Gregory's mild objections that we could just hire someone. I told him I wanted to cook for our anniversary the same way I'd cooked for him in our first apartment, when neither of us had money for catering, and I made braised short ribs on a 2-burner stove because I wanted to show him what I could do with almost nothing. It was true, that reason. It was also, I'll admit now, a kind of test. I wanted to see if the gesture would still mean anything to him, or if it had become invisible, the way so much of what I did for him over 11 years had quietly become invisible. It had become invisible. I confirmed that at 8:47 p.m., holding a tray of scallops, when he put his hand on my back and told me servants don't sit with us. I didn't say anything back to him in that moment. I want to walk you through exactly what I did instead, because the not saying was the whole point. I carried the tray into the kitchen, as instructed. I set it down on the counter, next to the 6 other trays I had prepared over 4 days, the braised short ribs, the roasted vegetables, the tart I'd made from a recipe that had been my grandmother's, the same grandmother whose coffee grinder still sat on my kitchen counter at home, still got used every morning at 5:15. I untied my apron, which I had put on over the dress specifically to protect it while I finished plating, and I hung it neatly on the hook by the pantry door. I checked my reflection in the dark window over the sink, dress fine, hair fine, face composed, and I walked back out into the party. I did not sit at the head table, where Gregory had arranged for Vanessa Okafor to be seated 3 chairs down, introduced to the room as one of the sharpest people on our team. I did not make a scene. I found a seat at a table near the back, with 2 of my own employees I'd invited, and I ate a plate of my own cooking, and I let people come to me instead of the other way around. At 9:30, Gregory tapped his glass for a toast. He talked for 6 minutes about the growth of Pruitt and Associates, about vision, about the team that had made it possible, and he thanked by name 4 of his senior staff, including Vanessa. He thanked me last, in 1 sentence, for holding it all together at home so I could focus on the business. 102 people clapped. I clapped too. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I have a woman clapping politely at her own erasure, in a dress she chose, in a kitchen she paid to renovate, at a party she cooked for. 2 days after the party, on a Monday, Gregory left for the office at 7:40 a.m., same as always. I made coffee, same as always, grinding the beans by hand in the quiet kitchen. And then I called Patricia, and I told her to file. The papers were served to him at his office on Wednesday by a process server Patricia had arranged at 2:15 in the afternoon, in front of the glass door with his name on it. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. Renata told me later, because Vanessa apparently mentioned it to a mutual contact who mentioned it to Renata, that Gregory had gone very quiet for the rest of that day and had left the office early and hadn't said a word to anyone about why. He called me that evening. I let it ring twice before I answered, not for effect, but because I was drying a dish and I finished drying it first. "Diane, what is this?" he said. Not a question, really. More of a demand dressed as one. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said. My voice was even. I remember being almost surprised by how even it was. "We can talk about this. We don't have to do this." "I think we do," I said. "I've thought about it for a long time, actually. Longer than you'd guess." There was a silence on the line. I could hear, faintly, the sound of the office around him, someone's phone ringing 2 desks over, a door closing. "Is this about the party?" he said finally. "About the kitchen thing. I didn't mean it like." "It's not about one sentence at one party, Gregory," I said. "It's about $58,000 to Larkspur Creative Consulting. It's about the Larkspur in 14 Tuesdays in 18 months. It's about the fact that you called me a servant in my own house, in front of 100 people, and you didn't even know how right you were about how you'd been treating me. You've just never said it out loud before." He didn't have a response to that. I didn't wait for one. I said, "Talk to your lawyer, Gregory. Mine's very good," and I hung up and I set the phone face down on the counter, and I finished drying the dish I'd started drying before I answered. That's the whole confrontation. That's all it ever was. No raised voices, no thrown plates, no scene for the neighbors to overhear. Just a woman finishing a chore she'd already started, on her way to a life she'd already decided to build. The divorce took 11 months, which Patricia told me was fast, given the business assets involved. The Larkspur Creative Consulting paper trail did exactly what she predicted. It moved the settlement conversation quickly, because Gregory's attorney understood, correctly, what a judge would think of $58,000 in diverted marital funds funneled to a mistress's shell company. I kept my firm entirely, as expected, since it had predated the marriage and I'd been careful about commingling. I received a settlement on the house, sold it, and used the proceeds as a down payment on a smaller place, a 2-bedroom brick house with a kitchen that gets morning light through a window over the sink, which was the single feature I insisted on when I was touring properties. I want to jump forward now because the ending of this story isn't really about Gregory at all. It's 18 months later. It's a Tuesday morning in October, and I'm standing in my kitchen, the deed with only my name on it, and it's 5:15 a.m., and I'm grinding coffee beans by hand in my grandmother's cast iron grinder, the same one, the only object I fought to keep from the old house besides my own clothes and my tools. The light outside is still blue-gray, not quite morning yet. My dog, a rescue mutt named Biscuit that I adopted 4 months after the divorce was finalized, is asleep in a patch of floor by the stove. The grinder makes its familiar rasping sound, slow and rhythmic, and the smell rises up before I've checked my phone, before I've opened my email, before I've become anyone's business partner or client contact or ex-wife for the day. Just my hands, the beans, and 15 minutes that belong entirely to me. The same 15 minutes I protected all through my marriage, except now nothing about the other 23 hours and 45 minutes has to be protected from anyone. My firm added 9 employees last year. I cooked, myself, the way I like to, a dinner for 12 for my own birthday in July, and every single person at that table had been invited because I wanted them there, not because their presence served anyone's purpose but mine. Renata sat to my right. Patricia, who has become something closer to a friend than a lawyer over these 18 months, sat across from me and made a toast that had nothing to do with vision or growth or holding anything together. She just said she was glad I was happy, and that was the whole toast, and it was enough. I heard, secondhand, that Gregory and Vanessa are still together. I don't feel much of anything about that, which surprised me the first time I noticed it. Not anger, not vindication, not even curiosity. Just the quiet, settled fact of a life that used to be mine and now belongs to other people entirely. I still make coffee every morning at 5:15. I still don't check my phone until it's ground and brewed and poured. Some rituals aren't about the person you built them around. They're about the 15 minutes that were always only mine. I am not a servant in anyone's house. I never was. It just took me a while to be sure I'd never sit at a table again where I had to wonder,